There's another thing that I wanted to talk about before we move on and start talking about particular libraries. So, one of the things that you've done recently is you've started making your libraries not React specific. So, making them where they're shareable across different front end frameworks. I thought that was a really interesting choice as well because, like the migration, the learning path from like untyped to typed libraries, going from like a targeting at a single framework to targeting at like generic usage is a really really challenging thing to do well. So could you talk a little bit about like what motivated that, and maybe even share some of your experience about like what you've learned from that process?
Yeah. Um, that transition that's still happening um, felt really natural uh, because of underlying technology uh, innovations that were kind of happening. So I think the first one for me was hooks. When hooks came out, it kind of kicked my mind into reusable logic mode, right? And no longer was I thinking like, oh, everything needs to be a component. We can just have hooks. And that kind of started detaching my brain from the two and decoupling. And I'm like, oh, you know what? Headless UI is where it's at. And the first library I used was Downshift from Kent C. Dodds. That I was like, oh yeah, headless is super cool. Um, so I was like, let's headless at everything. Let's go all headless for everything, right? But still React. Um, and then at that point, I was like, oh, this is interesting. It's reusable logic, um, like how much would it take to then decouple that logic from React utilities that I was using? Like React table, even when it was just a hook, used to be implemented with a bunch of React hooks under the hood. It's like use state, use memo, everything's use memoed and use callback everywhere. And I was just like, this is. But I wonder what it would take to move all that logic into an agnostic layer. Still hook it up the same way in like a React adapter. So that's kind of what I did. And I think it was just kind of this move to headless that it was like, oh, how headless can we go? I'll be honest, I don't have any applications. Maybe no, I don't anymore. I don't have any applications right now that aren't React, like that I have like in production. Um, so I don't necessarily have an immediate use case to be like, oh, let's go framework agnostic and let's you know, I need that. But it was easy enough after I went headless. It was kind of just a skip and a hop to rip out all the React stuff and replace it with just kind of an adapter, and that exposed some interesting patterns along the way. Um, like it reveals to me more clarity the pros and cons of React. The great things about it and the things that I'm like, I don't really like that so much. And then it started getting me thinking about other libraries and frameworks, and a lot of the challenges that came up that are still coming up in trying to make agnostic tools, and the different ways that every single framework thinks about reactivity. And I know that signals are a really hot topic right now, but I think they're very important to talk about because most of the entire ecosystem outside of React thinks in terms of signals or observables. And they have for a while. If you go back before React, it was kind of all about signals and observability and kind of this mutative API for reactive system. And React was kind of the very one of the first ones that was like, you know what, we're going to throw reactivity out the window and basically just going to create this massive immutable system. And immutability honestly wasn't all that popular, even in data, like even in front end, in data, like data flow. Immutability wasn't super popular until the React ecosystem really pushed it into overdrive. Including me, like I grew up, on React with this immutable paradigm, and so it was really interesting talking in the early days with Ryan Carniata. He's showing me solid and he's showing me signals and all these different ways to approach reactivity, and because I wanted to build solid adapters um, for all my libraries, and it really showed me that React is honestly kind of weird in a great way. Like it's really easy to it's easy to reason about data and immutability when you're in that mode. Um, but it comes with a lot of weird immutable overhead, like use memo and use callback. We're talking about compilers now. So most of my learnings through going agnostic have been shedding more and more light on just kind of these weird differences between these libraries. And I think at the surface level, everybody looks at Vue and React and Svelte, and they used to see maybe differences, and it was like template versus JSX, how do we do our markup and single file components? And a lot of that is becoming, it doesn't matter anymore. Like JSX is clearly superior, let's be honest. But what really is coming down to matter for me is just like the data flow and the data model. And kind of the last big like aha moment I've had with a lot of this is I was looking at my spreadsheets for like my budget and spreadsheets for things at work, and I'm looking at Excel and I'm just like, what a fantastic performant system. Excel's amazing. Basically built on signals, observability, right? And you can create crazy UIs in Excel. And it just got me thinking, maybe it's time to go back to signals. And now all the talk about signals and everything. So that's kind of been where my head has been with moving agnostic with all this stuff. It was very natural to push the boundaries. And I've gotten to the point now where I'm pushing maybe a little too hard on some of the agnostic stuff. And I've actually had to rebound a little bit. And that's mostly in the router that I'm building, if we want to talk about specific use cases. All of the other tools I have, query, table, the virtualizer, a lot of these tools, they fit really well into the agnostic, ecosystem. But the router is not one of those things. Like early on, I was like, even in my hype video that's on my Twitter right now that I showed at JamstackConf, it was like agnostic router. And it's like, could we build the agnostic router? It's like, yes, I did it. And you can build adapters for it. But you wouldn't leave the hoops that we were jumping through to get a core router state management system to work with both React and Solid. It was working with Ryan Carniato on this. It was like either way you're going to pay. If you build your core state management in an immutable fashion, you have to pay in performance to get it to work in an immutable system like Solid. And then I was like, what if we just wrote the state management for all of our libraries in Signals and Solid and stuff like that, like just Signals. And then we downsampled it to immutability for React. And you pay big time going that direction too. They're just so much at odds with each other. And then, over the last few weeks, I've been on vacation for 2 weeks, to be honest. And I got back, and one of the big realizations I had is that every single framework has its own router that's relatively first class for that framework, except for React. For whatever reason, I mean, we know the reasons. React was like, we're just a UI library. We're very unopinionated,
Yeah.
At least that's how it was.
Yeah.
We could talk about the differences today, but React was one of the first ecosystems where it's like, there's that it's even really possible to build a bunch of different great routers. And there are so many of them out there. Obviously React router is the most popular, but there's like Wouter, and Next.js has their own weird router now. So thinking about it from that perspective, router is the only library where I've kind of like dialed it back, and I'm like, okay, not everything needs to be agnostic. Router is framework, kind of. So I've dialed it back to make 10-stack router React only. And honestly, the hope is that I can take the ideas and the core out of that and transport that to other core routers like the Solid router. Like I'd love to help Ryan, rewrite the Solid router to be completely type safe and have all this great stuff. So sorry, that was really long-winded, but